Welcome everyone to our first podcast from the UT Austin chapter of Partners in Health Engage. I'm Neha, one of our community building coordinators.
Hey everyone, I'm Sid and I'm the other community building coordinator. Just wanted to welcome everyone listening again and to tell you that we have more scheduled podcasts upcoming, so be sure to keep up with our Instagram at PIH Engage at UT Austin. Just a quick reminder about PIH in general is that we're hosting a citywide connections meeting for Austin on November 18th. So feel free to come check that out, and we want to see more involvement from the community, so that'll be awesome. Let's talk about our podcast now. Every week, Neha and I will be hosting a different group of our community building team to talk about a case study that they've researched. And this week, with our information team leads, we'll be discussing tuberculosis. And not only tuberculosis, but some recent controversies that have been occurring around Johnson & Johnson, as well as something called Bedaquiline. So we're going to get into that, but first let's go ahead and introduce the guests of our podcast today.
Hey everyone, I'm Moiz and I'm one of the information team leads.
Hi, I'm Faye and I'm one of the information team leads as well.
Hi, I'm Kyra, one of the information team members.
First, we're going to talk about tuberculosis is history so that you guys can have some context on why we should care and why it's been such an important thing in the past.
Yeah, so to get started, tuberculosis is a disease that's existed for thousands of years. The mycobacterium, tuberculosis bacteria, causes it, and it affects various parts of the body, but it primarily impacts the lungs. The transmission of TB occurs through the air and when an infected individual coughs or sneezes.
So there are a lot of scholars that theorize that TB is kind of one of the earliest literary references to disease. And as early as 3,300 to 2,300 years ago in India and China, there were descriptions of familiar symptoms to TB, and it was referenced as corpse disease. In the Bible, it's actually referenced as a Hebrew word that translates to consumption, which is kind of one of the words that is often used throughout history in the biblical books of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. In the Americas and Egypt, it's evidenced to be in mummified tissues in the form of Pott's disease. And in the Greek period, Hippocrates named it phthisis. And so it has this incredible history in that every civilization, or nearly every civilization that we know of, was concerned about it. And it was one of those things where it was a daily part of the lives and concerns of the health and well-being of these civilizations.
Until the 1950s, TB posed a significant public health challenge in developed countries, only subsiding with the development of the first effective TB medications.
So let's talk a little bit about the discovery of TB and the discovery of TB medications. So TB was originally discovered by an individual called Robert Koch. He may be familiar to many of you if you're kind of interested in microbiology as the individual who derived Koch's postulates. He derived this from his discovery of tuberculosis. So even in the field of microbiology, he's this super important figure that derived central ideas and tenets based on tuberculosis. So he originally found this Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and the medical community was shocked. I mean, we had come across this incredible discovery, but it wasn't until 60 or so years later that we found a effective treatment. And at that point, it was being called things like the White Plague and the White Death, and it was infecting, industrializing cities that were kind of having horrible working conditions. So the first treatment in the 1940s was found by an individual by the name of Selman Waksman and his assistant Albert Schatz. They, in the back of a chicken's throat, found something that could halt tuberculosis growth, and that was streptomycin. So streptomycin, will cover just a little bit about how it works. Streptomycin inhibits the translation of mRNA into proteins by inhibiting the ribosome, specifically the 16S rRNA subunit of the ribosome. Streptomycin is shipped into the Mycobacterium tuberculosis cell.
The medical community started to to pop champagne and said mission accomplished.
However, those cries of joy were very short-lived. If you're listening from the United States, tuberculosis isn't even something that we think about very often. We might get tested for it, but we might not even know what it is. You likely have no clue in how pervasive it was in history. The problem is that people think of tuberculosis as something of the past. We often think it was a major health issue and that we solved it in the 50s. But in reality, the rest of the world is still dealing with it today. It is still a major health issue. And according to the WHO, TB is the 13th leading cause of death and the second leading infectious disease killer in the world.
So, if we found treatment, how is it still a massive problem today? Well, during the 1970s and 80s, as developed countries continued to improve sanitation and incidence rates dropped, there was a lot of complacency from worldwide organizations. As these developed countries improved, many TB programs faced budget cuts. This, combined with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, placed a lot of severe economic and health care strain on under-resourced countries, and it's been a cycle of struggle since then. Factors like poverty, homelessness, travel, and migration exposed even more people to TB, and suddenly the rates once again began to rise. As TB rose, medications were even more difficult to distribute, and the toll of TB spread throughout the world.
The war against tuberculosis has yet to end. However, the issue is no longer one of biology. It's a socioeconomic phenomenon. For many, exposure to tuberculosis is not a choice. This structural violence disadvantages and burdens the progression of nations, and a lack of access to care maintains social order and exploitation for the wealthy. There is no incentive for powerful nations to address this injustice towards inhumanity.
Yeah, that's exactly right. TB is still a major public health problem worldwide, especially in low and middle income countries. In 2021, TB killed about 1.6 million people. To give context, that's more than HIV and malaria combined. HIV is not curable, so how does a disease that is treatable kill significantly more people?
The main focus of the conversation today is not just regular tuberculosis, but also multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, also called MDR-TB, is a type of tuberculosis that has become resistant to the many forms of treatment we have available to use today. So how did MDR-TB develop?
A lot of people think the main reason MDR-TB developed was because we didn't really understand what we were doing with antibiotics. Overprescription, and even today, people not taking their full doses just allows these bacteria, which are rapidly reproducing in your body, to gain some type of mutation that will make curing tuberculosis harder.
As we had said earlier, tuberculosis has been eradicated mentally from the daily concerns of our privilege, but it echoes as a daily horror in the households of most. Dr. Paul Farmer is a co-founder of Partners in Health, and he, in Haiti, provides a breakdown and a logical argument against the excuses that a lot of countries use to deem tuberculosis as a doomed effort. Many countries indicate that treatment is met with non-compliance, meaning that an individual that is diagnosed with tuberculosis doesn't go through with the proper treatment, which involves months of taking medication. But it often blames the agency of the sick and poor, but it neglects the structural barriers to their healthcare. When an individual is not able to access their medication, it makes it so much harder for them to be compliant. Dr. Paul Farmer indicates his experience with a young man from Haiti named Robert David, who in 1986 began experiencing symptoms. And originally he had to travel 2 hours either by donkey, on the back of a donkey, or in a wagon in order to go get treatment. However, his tuberculosis treatment would often get interrupted because he would have to stay home to work or to isolate or whatnot. And so when he sought this care over many, many years of trying to be compliant to his care, Dr. Paul Farmer even indicated that he was a very highly motivated individual to solve his case of tuberculosis. And eventually he developed multi-drug resistant tuberculosis because he was not able to initially solve this issue. So Robert's case kind of illustrates the number of complexities in treating drug-resistant tuberculosis and how access to treatment and especially when one can afford it and how available it is and the infrastructure that's available to an individual can impact an individual's health outcomes.
Now let's delve into a breakthrough in the treatment of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Here we're going to talk about Bedaquiline.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it because Bedaquiline is a game changer in tuberculosis treatment. An important note is that the Johnson & Johnson family company originally developed this drug and got FDA approval for its commercial use in 2012.
What makes Bedaquiline so special is that it's the first new drug for tuberculosis treatment in over 40 years.
Because MDR-TB is impervious to the usual TB drugs, it poses a significant challenge to this effective and previously known treatment. In the past, treatment options were limited and often less effective, only being able to cure 55% of MDR-TB patients. Many older treatments for MDR-TB also had severe side effects, which in some cases include permanent deafness, blindness, and even psychosis.
In comparison, Bedaquiline has much fewer and less severe side effects. Also, Bedaquiline is taken orally, which creates far less transportation and storage issues compared to other MDR-TB drugs, which are often injected. Because of this and many other reasons, the WHO recommends Bedaquiline as the main drug for treatment against MDR-TB.
So, can you guys talk about how Bedaquiline even works in the first place?
Yeah, Bedaquiline targets a specific protein in the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria, disrupting its ability to produce energy. By doing this, it causes cell death and acts as a bactericide.
This is incredible and all, but our main topic of today is about the lack of accessibility of Bedaquiline.
It's clear that Bedaquiline has marked a turning point in the battle against tuberculosis, especially in the cases of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. However, it highlights the importance of addressing the global distribution and availability of this crucial medication.
Yeah, so the fight against tuberculosis requires not only innovative drugs like Bedaquiline, but it's also the concerted effort by all of us in society to make them available to those who need them the most.
So now that we've talked about Bedaquiline, let's shift our focus back to the makers of this life-saving drug, the pharmaceutical giant Johnson & Johnson. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of them because they're in a lot of our households as soaps, as in various other products. And they have patent control over Bedaquiline, a medication that is so critical in our fight.
Johnson & Johnson's role in this history is far from commendable. According to MSF, as of August 2019, only 36,353 people had received Bedaquiline worldwide since its approval in 2012. To put that into perspective, an estimated 1.6 million people succumb to multi-drug resistant tuberculosis every year, and only 1 in 3 people infected with MDR-TB receive treatment in 2021.
One of the most contentious issues here is that Johnson & Johnson is the sole owner of the Bedaquiline patent, essentially giving them a monopoly control over this life-saving drug. However, this drug was actually developed with a lot of support from taxpayers, nonprofit organizations, and philanthropic sources. And a lot of the studies and research outside of Johnson & Johnson contributed to the understanding of Bedacoline's effectiveness against drug-resistant tuberculosis. So we clearly can see that Johnson & Johnson is not the only participant in the making and production of Bedaquiline. Despite this, Johnson & Johnson has held a monopoly over Bedaquiline for the past decade.
What's even more disconcerting is the revelation that J&J is attempting to intentionally prolong their monopoly over Bedaquiline through a practice known as evergreening. This tactic involves filling additional patents on various variations of the drug, effectively extending their control.
I do want to point out that when they file these additional patents, the drug itself is not critically changed. They simply change a few parts of the drug, or change how it's distributed, or change how it's given or taken by patients. Also, when it comes to pricing, Johnson & Johnson's practices leave much to be desired. Prior to July 2023, the lowest price Johnson & Johnson charged for 20 months of Bedaquiline was nearly $1,200, which is about $2 a day. However, researchers have calculated that it could be produced and sold at a profit for as little as 25 cents per day. We can clearly see the price gouge there.
So this lowest price was exclusively offered through the Stop TB Partnership, which is a United Nations hosted organization dedicated to ending the TB global health crisis, and isn't available to every country or patient. So J&J has remained far from transparent. And
in the midst of this controversy, the emergence of extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis also adds another layer of urgency. It's also known as XDR-TB. XDR-TB is a strain of tuberculosis that's not only resistant to frontline drugs like MDR-TB, but also secondary drugs that include bedaquiline. MDR-TB developed because of a lack of accessible treatment, and we are now already seeing the next phase of antibiotic resistance in tuberculosis because of further lack of access to bedaquiline. This implies devastating consequences not only for under-resourced countries that are currently suffering from tuberculosis, but for the entire world.
In July this year, John Green, a well-known author and advocate for tuberculosis awareness and treatment, released a video discussing J&J's intent to enforce their secondary patent on bedaquiline and how it will affect tuberculosis patients in the years to come. This video drew mass outrage across the internet, placing tremendous pressure on Johnson & Johnson to reconsider evergreening bedaquiline.
In response, Johnson & Johnson made a statement opposing these claims, stating that they have already entered into a collaboration with the Stop TB Partnership's Global Drug Facility to invite potential generic suppliers and purchase generic versions of bedaquiline. However, they did not acknowledge that at the time they had not actually granted Stop TB Partnership the licenses required to procure and supply generic bedaquiline. Johnson & Johnson also claimed that they had shipped more than 660,000 courses of bedaquiline to 159 countries since launch in 2012, but they did not acknowledge that that number is only a fraction of the estimated 32 million people who have died of tuberculosis since 2012.
Eventually, because of this public backlash, J&J was forced to make a compromise. Without this outrage and without this advocacy from strong leaders in our community, who knows if this would ever happen? And J&J would have continued to have that patent. 2 days after John Green's video was released, the Stop TB Partnership announced that they were granted licenses to supply bedaquiline generics, and as of September 29th, Johnson & Johnson announced their intent not to enforce bedaquiline patents.
So, even though this conflict has been resolved, it's not an isolated incident. Issues related to pharmaceutical companies and patent manipulation are widespread. Even recently, there was a call to action asking for Danaher to take accountability on price gouging their tuberculosis diagnosis tests.
This tale of patents and access to life-saving medications is just one example of a much larger issue. Within the pharmaceutical industry, profits are often the motive, and they overshadow the imperative to save lives and promote global health. It's imperative that we as citizens stay informed on pharmaceutical companies and their medications to advocate for accessibility and minimize these companies taking advantage of their patient populations. It is lives and not profits that must take precedence in our fight for healthcare equity. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.